This presentation will look at the relationship between social connection and acculturation strategies for refugees in Australia. This is a really important issue as forced migration and displacement are currently at record high rates around the world. Recent figures estimate that 65 million individuals are displaced worldwide. 38% of these individuals are externally displaced, being either asylum seekers, so externally displaced individuals who are yet to be granted refugee status, or refugees who have been granted the option to legally settle in a host country on either a temporary or permanent basis following the forced migration. In Australia, there are just under 1 million refugees currently residing, and with 13,750 more added to this number each year. This widespread resettlement emphasises the importance of understanding, as a host country, how we can best support the relocation and social integration of refugees. In most of these cases, these individuals are facing new and sometimes very different cultures. And as a result of this, they are forced to undertake the process of acculturation. Acculturation is the process of cultural and psychological change that involves integrating ideas, beliefs, values, and behaviours from one's home culture into life in a newly adopted culture. One of the most prominent theoretical models in this field was developed by John Berry. There are two dimensions to this theory: the strength of identification with the host culture and the strength of maintenance of the home culture. So as you can see here, based on this theory, there are 4 possible acculturation strategies and ultimately outcomes that can occur. These are assimilation, integration, separation, and marginalization. So assimilation is when an individual adopts the host culture's norms and de-identifies with their home culture. Integration is when an individual identifies with both the host and home culture, striking a balance between the two. Separation is when an individual does not adopt or identify at all with the host culture. And marginalization is when an individual does not identify with the host culture, but also becomes disengaged from their home culture. Research that has been conducted in this area pretty much unanimously suggests that the integration strategy is the most desirable and tends to lead to the strongest sense of identity and most effective psychological adjustment for an individual. On the other hand, marginalization and separation are often associated with negative outcomes, such as depression, anxiety, loneliness, and lower self-esteem. Now, it's really important to note that these acculturation strategies somewhat assume that acculturating individuals and groups have the freedom to choose how they want to engage in intercultural relations. This, of course, is not always the case. In addition to the predetermined migration and demographic factors, such as age, gender, education, and country of origin, attitudes of their family, community, and society also influence their acculturation experience. For example, a large comparative study among refugee youth by Berry in 2010 showed that determining how well youth adapt is not simply a question of how they choose to acculturate, but the nature of the society in which they reside. This is supported by a study by Hatos in 2012 that found despite a desire to integrate with Australian culture, Sudanese refugees felt excluded by virtue of being Black, which is seen as incompatible with being Australian. In fact, a large number of qualitative and quantitative studies on refugee populations in Australia have found that discrimination and prejudice reduce the likelihood that refugees will identify with the host culture, despite maybe initially wanting to, therefore increasing the risk of separation and marginalization. On the other hand, quality social connection and positive intercultural relations promote acculturation strategies such as integration, as they provide refugees with a sense of belonging and inclusion. These connections can come in a form of schooling, not-for-profit programs, religious groups, and even just informal meetings with neighbours and members of the community. Another really interesting finding was from a qualitative study in 2018 on refugee youth resettled in South Australia. In addition to experiences of discrimination, a number of the participants also indicated that their parents did not approve of them adopting Australian cultural norms and prefer them to solely identify with their home culture. This created a really strong sense of conflict for the youth and made it difficult to adopt an acculturation strategy of integration, despite their desire to engage and identify with Australian culture. These findings highlight the important role of social relationships with members from both host and home cultures, and the influence that they have in the acculturation experience of refugees in Australia. However, despite these interesting findings, there are still some limitations and gaps with the current research. For example, although the qualitative work of focus groups and interviews provide rich data and insight into the lived experiences of refugees in Australia, there are issues that they cannot be generalised in the traditional sense of the term. This is why it's important to continue to build on the qualitative research in this area and increase the transferability of the conclusions to other refugee populations within and beyond Australia. On the other hand, one of the main challenges that quantitative research in this field faces is the inconsistency of measurement scales. They tend to use a variety of acculturation scales, and these are typically modified in an attempt to counter for the Western bias of the scales. When we're looking at gaps in the current research, there is a notable lack of longitudinal studies in this area. Longitudinal design would be particularly beneficial in this area, as it could provide insight into the development of acculturation strategies and how social connection and relationships, or lack thereof, impact them over time. It would also make it possible to provide causal and directional evidence, which is not currently possible using many of the existing research methods. Lastly, there tends to be a focus on either youth or adult refugees in Australia. There is limited research looking at the bidirectional relationship between these two, particularly within a family setting. For example, are children or parents more likely to adopt an acculturation strategy of integration? And to what degree does the parent's acculturation approach influence their child's approach, and vice versa? Lastly, how can this relationship influence acculturation strategy development over time? These types of research questions are important as they can help us to understand how we can develop effective programs to support both parents and children's needs. If we can help to foster family environments that promote positive acculturation strategies such as integration, this could act as a protective factor against negative social influences commonly experienced by refugees, such as discrimination and prejudice. Thank you for your time.